Chapter 12 Showdown. After work on Saturday, I told Kenneth and Holly of my plans to visit Grandma Belinda again. "How will you get there?" Kenneth asked. "I guess I'll take a taxi. Olivia practically forbade me to visit, so I won't get Raymond to take me, and Carrie has his hands full with Uncle Jacob in the hospital, as well as having to do all the work. He's very worried about this year's cranberry harvest, too." "I can take you," Holly offered. When I started to shake my head, she insisted. "Really, I don't mind." I thought about it and started to laugh, thinking what would it be like for us to drive up in Holly's psychedelic car. It would certainly catch everyone's attention. Kenneth saw the wide grin on my face. "Melanie's imagining what sort of entrance you two will make dressed in your saris, headbands, crystal earrings, and sandals, Holly," he said, staring at me with laughter in his eyes. "Why?" Holly asked. "Why? This is a rest home for New England blue bloods. They haven't seen anything like you, even in their senile hallucinations," he replied. Holly thought a moment, then smiled. "Well, then we'll be a special treat for them, won't we?" "I don't think I can dress that way," I said softly, not wanting to hurt Holly's feelings. "I've only just met my grandmother. She might not even recall meeting, so I better not do anything to confuse her. I was thinking I would wear what I wore the first time." "Oh, dress the way you want, Melanie. So will I. This might be fun," she squealed. I like talking to elderly people. Often they have better understanding of cosmic center. "That's because they're closer to becoming pure energy," Kenneth quipped and then winked at me. Once Kenneth had determined he was ready to begin sculpting the marble block, he became more relaxed and more confident about focusing in his creative energy. He declared that the work was already completed. "Completed?" I looked at the block and then shook my head in confusion. "In here," he said, pointing to his head, "it's done. All I have to do is bring it out, follow the blueprint. I have become a mere tool of my artistic consciousness. Do you understand?" "Oh yes, I think so," I told him. A month ago I might have thought he was weird, even mad, but after having him lecture me daily about the creative eye, and after hearing Holly talk about the power of focused energy, I really did appreciate what he was saying. He was pleased I understood. At the end of our work days now, Kenneth would pour the three of us a glass of cranberry wine, my glass only being a third or so full. It was really Holly's idea. People who work so hard as you two do have to step back and permit their spirits and bodies to join hands again, she said. We usually sat on the small patio between the house and studio and watched Shell, the turtle, navigate around the rocks and the fish in the small pond. The sun was still high enough in the sky to provide warm rays, but it really wasn't unbearably hot, and there was usually late afternoon breeze coming off the sea. The conversation was mostly between Holly and Kenneth, the two of them talking about people they had known and the things Holly did in New York City. I never felt like a mere observer, however, because one or the other would often turn to me and explain something or someone. It was from these conversations I had gleaned an idea of what Kenneth had been like when he was only a few years older than I. There appeared to have been a bright period in his life, a period when he was as bohemian as Holly, carefree and far more social. And then from what they said, I understood he lost contact with all their mutual friends and had done little or nothing with anyone, even here in Providencetown. Holly constantly complained about his failure to visit her and her shop in New York. Kenneth merely smiled and promised he would someday. "When the stars are correctly aligned for it," he added, shifting his eyes impishly to me. "The stars have been aligned for it many times, Ken. You've got to be aligned," Holly replied, and we all laughed. Holly was right about our quiet time. Although I was tired, our half an hour or so of relaxation always put me in a good mood, and I was able to bring some happiness home to help cheer up Aunt Sarah during her troubled time. When I arrived at the house after work this particular Saturday, however, I found out Aunt Sarah more upset than usual. Carrie was still out at the lobster boat, and she was worried about visiting Uncle Jacob. He's called 3 times asking for Carrie, she moaned. I can't imagine what's happening to him. He knows how his father worries up there, and he knows we can't let him worry, she said, her face full of 1,000 anxieties. Uncle Jacob surely understands that things can keep Carrie busy for working late. It's happened many times before, hasn't it, Aunt Sarah? I asked. I knew that since Uncle Jacob had been given phone privileges, he called a number of times during the day, giving Aunt Sarah's orders, making demands, and questioning her to death. I assumed many of those questions had to do with me. It's hard for him, she said. He feels like a prisoner chained to his bed by the doctors and nurses, fed medicines and prohibited from doing the simplest things. They had to give him bathroom privileges faster than they wanted because Jacob refused to sit on a bedpan, she added. He's been hounding the doctor to let him go home. I wanted to say it was very hard for Carrie too, and especially hard for her in May, but I put a zipper on my lips and helped her get dinner ready instead. However, when Carrie wasn't home an hour later, even I became worried. Uncle Jacob called to speak with him, complaining that Carrie had neglected to report the day's catch. Aunt Sarah had to tell him Carrie wasn't there. I don't know, I heard her say. I'm getting very worried. Should I send Melanie down to the dock, she asked him. I saw her eyes shift from me as she listened to him speak. She nodded and promised to call him as soon as she had the news. Then she cradled the phone and wrung her hands. What did Uncle Jacob say? Should I go to the dock, I asked her. May was staring at us, her eyes full of worry too. He said, you wouldn't know what to look for or who to ask, she replied, shaking her head as she did so. I can see if the boat's there, can I? Yes, she said. I saw it took great courage for her to disagree with anything Jacob uttered. Then I'll go, I declared, and started out of the kitchen. May called to me and then signed for her desire to go too. I nodded and she leaped to her feet and took my hand. The two of us marched out of the house and over the dunes, both straining to see the activity at the dock. We had only a few thousand yards down to the beach to discover there wasn't anyone there. The lobster boat was nowhere in sight either. Where is he? I asked myself out loud. May tugged on my hand and signed the same question. I shook my head and continued toward the dock. When we got there, we stood looking out at the sea, searching in every direction for the sign of the boat. I saw an oil barge going south and a larger cargo ship, but no sign of the lobster boat. I just hated returning to the house with no news, but I knew the longer we remained here, the more Aunt Sarah would worry, and Uncle Jacob was sure to call again. Maybe there was a reason to worry, I thought. This wasn't like Carrie. Even though the weather was picture perfect, accidents do happen at sea. It would be just horrible if something had happened now, with Uncle Jacob still in the hospital, I thought. Since I had been practicing tuning into cosmic energies with Holly, I paid more attention to my feelings and instincts than I did, and I didn't like the heavy little ball of worry that was growing in my chest. There was nothing to do but go home and wait with Aunt Sarah. I started to turn away when Meg tugged on my hand and pointed north. I looked but saw nothing. What? She pointed more empathetically. Her eyes were more seaworthy than mine, for she had grown up here and she knew how to read the twilight glitter on the surface of the ocean. I strained to see as two almost indistinguishable dots grew into shapes that were slowly moving closer to shore. What is it? We walked to the edge of the dock and waited till the shapes became 2 boats, one looking like a tugboat. Finally, I could make out the lobster boat clearly. It was being towed toward the dock. Oh, thank goodness, I declared. May smiled and started to sign an explanation. She recalled something like this happening before. The boat had broke down at sea and Uncle Jacob had to radio for help. When Carrie drew close enough to see us, he waved from the starboard bow. The sun had almost completely dipped behind the horizon and the lobster boat was delivered to the dock. Carrie and Roy Patterson got it tied up and Carrie hurried off to tell us the story. The catch was good, but suddenly our engine died and we weren't able to fix it. How's Ma? He asked quickly, knowing she would be concerned. She's very worried, Carrie. Uncle Jacob keeps calling from the hospital. Let's go up to the house, he said. Roy said he would take care of everything and we hurried back. Carrie looked exhausted. His hands were full of grease and there were streaks across his face, which was darker, even red crests on his cheeks. I'll wash up and go right to the hospital, he said. Taking such long, deep strides over the sand, May and I had trouble keeping up with him. You have to have supper first, Carrie. Just call him. He nodded, but he looked more concerned about his father than he was about the problems with the boat. He's gonna blame it on me, he muttered, but I didn't do anything different. We had oil pressure problems. I'm sure he'll understand. May said something like this happened before anyway, right? Right, he said, but he didn't sound confident. Aunt Sarah was at 6s and 7s by the time we arrived. She had practically worn her skin off, wringing her hands together in worry. Carrie quickly explained what happened, and she told him to call Uncle Jacob. You guys just eat, he said after his conversation with his father and hung up. I've got to wash up and run to the hospital. But Carrie, it's okay, he said. He wants to know the details. I'll eat something later. Go on, don't wait. But he charged up the stairs before I could protest anymore. I looked at Aunt Sarah and she shook her head and went about serving our dinner. Be back as soon as I can, Carrie called from the front door, and less than 10 minutes later. I don't know why you can't get something to eat first, I called back, but he was already out the door. I looked at Aunt Sarah. She was troubled but silent. Uncle Jacob is pretty selfish, Aunt Sarah. Carrie's had a miserable day. He's tired and hungry. You should have made him eat. I can't worry about Jacob now, she cried in defense. He's still recuperating. I choked back my angry words and drank them down with water. If Uncle Jacob had been an ogre before, I thought he would be a bigger monster now. He was sure to take advantage of his own illness at every opportunity. It was nearly 3 hours later before Carrie returned. Aunt Sarah had been trying to do needlepoint, but her eyes lifted every time she heard a creak in the house or a sound of an automobile outside. I should have gone too, she muttered. When Carrie entered, she threw down the needlework and jumped up to greet him at the living room door. He's fine, Carrie said quickly. He looked more exhausted than I'd ever seen him. I saw that fatigue didn't come from his day's labor so much as from the emotional tension he had just experienced. I think he might even be released in a day or so. Really? Oh, that would be wonderful, Aunt Sarah cried, clapping her hands together. She quickly signed the news to May, whose face lit up with a smile. It occurred to me that no matter how I saw Uncle Jacob or what I thought of him, he was still Aunt Sarah's husband and May's father. They loved him, and in his own way he surely loved them. I had no right to be critical of him, I thought, especially now when he was recuperating from one of the worst illnesses anyone could have. But one of the doctors stopped me in the hallway, Carrie continued, and made it perfectly clear that Dad can't go back to the way he was, not for some time. If he doesn't rest, eat right, and exercise, he could have a relapse. Oh dear, did they make that clear to Jacob? Aunt Sarah asked, her hands fitting about, nervously tugging on her dress and brushing at her hair. Too clear, Carrie said, shifting his gaze to me. I understood this was a major reason why his visit was so long and difficult. He's furious about it. Says they don't know what they're talking about. That it's work that makes a man strong, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. He vowed he won't be anyone's cripple, and doctors threatened to keep him in the hospital. You have to tell him, Ma. You have to put your foot down too, Carrie said. Aunt Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with fear and worry. Of course I will, Carrie, she said. Yes, all of us will do what we can to help him understand, won't we? She asked, turning to me. I smiled. Yes, Aunt Sarah. Did you eat anything, Carrie? I had a candy bar. Got it from the machine in the hospital. Oh, well, I kept everything warm for you, Carrie, Aunt Sarah said. Just sit and I'll get you a plate. I'm not hungry, Mom. Of course you are, especially after the day you've had, she insisted. Now she added when he opened his mouth. If you expect me to tell your father what to do, at least listen when I speak to you, she said. Carrie laughed. Okay, let me just call Roy and see about the repairs on the boat. I have to give Dad a report before he goes to sleep, too, he said when he went to the phone. Afterward, May and I joined him at the dining room table and watched him eat. When Aunt Sarah went back into the kitchen, he leaned over to whisper to me. He's bad, Melanie, crankier and meaner than ever. He swears he's going to sneak back on the boat first chance he gets. I told him I wouldn't go out then, and he fumed at me for a good half hour until I calmed him down. When I first got there, he accused me of not checking the oil before I took out the boat. I always check the engine, Melanie, he assured me. I know what can happen out there, he said. I believe you, and I don't know why he wouldn't. It's just his condition, I guess. It makes him ornery. Well, he should be just the opposite. He should be pleased and proud that his son is stepping up during his emergency. No, please. That's all I need is him thanking me and thinking that we're conspiring against him while he's ill. He thinks of it anyway, Carrie. No, he doesn't, Carrie said, but I saw the way he dropped his eyes quickly. What did he ask you about me? Come on, I urged. He started to look up and reply, but Aunt Sarah returned. When she left again, I repeated my question. Reluctantly, he answered. His brain is all jumbled up from the heart attack, I'm sure. Come on, Carrie. He wanted to know if you were spreading stories about him and your mother. I told him he had to be hallucinating to think something like that, and he got so mad at me, I had to leave the room for a while. That's when I met his doctor and heard what was going to happen. Can you think of any reason why he would ask me that question, Carrie asked, his gaze fixed on me. No, I said quickly. What Uncle Jacob had said to me in the CCU was never meant to be repeated. It was as scared as a dying person's confession to a priest. I had no intention of uttering a word of it, ever. Carrie shrugged and returned to his dinner. That's why I said he's hallucinating, he muttered. He eyed me as he chewed his food, and I turned to May to ask her if she wanted to play Chinese checkers. Before we rose to go in the living room, I told everyone I was going to visit my grandmother tomorrow. Aunt Sarah stopped clearing the dishes. Oh dear, is that wise, Melanie? She asked. Very wise, I said. I like her and she likes me. We have to get to know each other before it's too late. Yes, I suppose you do, Aunt Sarah said, but I'm sure Olivia has nothing to say about it, I chimed in quickly. Oh dear, Aunt Sarah said. All this commotion at once, oh dear. She hurried back into the sanctuary of her kitchen. Carrie gazed up at me with eyes of appreciation and glee. Grandma Olivia has met her match in you, Melanie Logan, he said, struggling to contain his amusement. Yes, she has, whether she likes it or not, I fired back, and Carrie gave into a fit of laughter. Confused at all the commotion, May tugged on my hand for explanations. Instead, I took her into the living room for our game of Chinese checkers. Carrie came to watch us play and fell asleep at his father's chair. No one had the heart to wake him. Jacob does that often now, Aunt Sarah said, gazing at Carrie with her eyes, two twin pools of sadness. She sighed. Let him sleep. May and I went to bed. Aunt Sarah tinkered around the house until she had gotten herself tired enough and came up too. Hours later, I heard Carrie's footsteps on the stairway. He paused at my door, then went on to his own room. The boy in him was being shoved further and further back into his memory as he was forced to become a man of responsibility and duty. How lucky were those who could have a full and happy youth. Holly was there in the morning, as she promised. It was the first time Carrie had seen the car, or her for that matter. She wore one of her long flowing dresses and a matching headband, opal earrings in the silver setting, and a jade necklace and her pink and green sandals. She even painted a small pink and green dot on each of her cheeks. At first Carrie was amazed, and then he thought she was all very amusing. Aunt Sarah merely dropped her jaw and retreated into the house with May. I introduced Carrie to Holly, and she immediately asked him his date of birth. Why? He asked. I know you're a Gemini, she said, but I need more details about your birthday. Huh? Carrie turned to me. We have to go, I said quickly. I want to make the visiting hours. Oh, yes, Holly said. Perhaps I'll see you later and we can talk again, Holly told Carrie. He nodded, and I got into Holly's car. I made something for your grandmother, she told me as we drove away. It's right in the back seat. I turned and found a crystal embedded in a blob of silvery gray stone. It looked like a petrified scrambled egg. What is it? I had to ask. It's a paperweight, Holly explained. And it has a leptolalia light in the center. It aids muscles, strengthens the heart, and is very beneficial to the blood. What's most important is it aids sleep, which I know is a problem for the elderly. Try to get her to keep it close to her bed, she advised. Thank you, Holly, I said, wondering not only what Grandma Belinda would think, but what Mrs. Green and her assistants would do. Holly thought the rest home was truly beautiful and in a tranquil place. Whoever chose this location was sensitive to positive energy, she declared. I can feel it. It's ideal for meditation. There were half a dozen or so other vehicles in the visitors' parking lot when we pulled up. I saw a man and a woman helping an elder lady walk along the garden pathway. The two elderly gentlemen I had met when I came the first time were on the porch again, sitting in the same seats, only today both were wearing suits and ties and had their hair neatly combed. Well now, the one who had first spoken to me last time, you came to entertain us, have you? He said, looking at Holly. No, sir, she said, we're just visiting someone. That them? The other man shouted. No, they're just visiting someone. Who'd you say that you were? Just visiting, he repeated. Holly laughed and followed me through the entrance. Mrs. Green was in the lobby, talking with some of the residents who were apparently waiting to be entertained. Mrs. Green straightened up quickly and hurried towards us, the attendant moving to join her. Yes, she said. I'm Melanie Logan, remember? I visited my grandmother, Belinda Gordon, recently. Yes, I recall. She pulled her shoulders back and stiffened her jaw. I remember I specifically asked you not to give her any candy, she said sharply. What? I explained how important it is that she not be given any candy. They share what they are given, and they don't know who's diabetic and who isn't. I thought you understood that. It's simple enough request, she added, drawing her lips thin. I didn't give her any candy, I said. No? Well, she had it in her room right after you left, Mrs. Green said with a twisted smirk. I don't think Melanie would lie, ma'am, Holly said softly. She had a way of disagreeing with someone that made it sound pleasant, but Mrs. Green stepped back and drank her in with one look of disgust. And who might you be? Just a friend, Holly said. Yes, well, I'm afraid I can't permit anyone but immediate family to visit, Mrs. Green said. And we do ask that our visitors dress decently. We value our reputation here. Our clients are highly respectable people, and a number of them are visiting with their loved ones at the moment. Decency comes from the heart, not from the outer garb, Holly said, still speaking softly. Mrs. Green ignored her and turned back to me. I've spoken with Mrs. Logan, she said, and she has left instructions that for the time being no one's to visit her sister. I assumed she would have told you. What do you mean no one? I'm her granddaughter. I raised my voice. I'm not just anyone. The attendant moved closer. Some of the residents stopped talking and turned our way. Please lower your voice, Mrs. Green said, shouting a glance at some of the people who were visiting a relative. Why can't I see my grandmother? I demanded. Her condition is very delicate. We're just trying to do the best for her, Mrs. Green replied with a smile so phony it dripped. Surely, having a loved one visit can't be anything but good, Holly said. Mrs. Green shot her a look that, if it had been a dart, it would have pierced Holly's pleasant smile and gone right through her head. I'm not leaving here without seeing my grandmother. I fired at her and planted my feet so firmly it was as if they were nailed to the floor. Mrs. Green studied us for a moment, and I saw a look of retreat in her eyes, which quickly fell to the gift in my hand. And what is that you're bringing her? It's a crystal paperweight, and it has healing powers, I said. Mrs. Green smiled coldly. I can't permit it. We have control over what is brought into the room. What harm can this do to her? I can't permit it, she repeated. It's against my better judgment. But I will permit you, and you alone, to visit your grandmother for half an hour. Why am I limited in time? No one else is, I protested. That's my final decision. I have a major responsibility here. The welfare of my guests, all my guests, must be taken into consideration. And I repeat, only immediate family, she said, sending another look of disgust to Holly's way. Holly put her hand on mine and smiled. I'll just go wait out on the porch, she said with a wink. I knew that she would enjoy speaking with the two elderly gentlemen. She took the paperweight from my hands and turned to Mrs. Green. Perhaps I can make this a present to you, she said. One of the qualities of a lepidolite is that it enhances someone's expression of inner light and joy. Ridiculous, Mrs. Green said and pivoted. Gerson, show Mrs. Logan to Mrs. Gordon's room. She's in her room, I asked. It was such a beautiful day, and most of the residents had been brought to the lobby for their entertainment. Why was Grandma Belinda shut up in her room? Yes, she said, lifting the corner of her mouth until it cut into her cheek. She's not feeling well today. That's why I want to limit your visit. Your cooperation will be appreciated, she added, and returned to the people whom she had been talking to when we arrived. This way, the attendant said. He had a sharp, sarcastic smile on his lips. Holly pressed my hand and nodded. Go on, I'll be fine, she said. I followed the attendant through the lobby and down the corridor to the residence room. I was even angrier when I saw Grandma Belinda. Her door was shut, and she was sitting in her rocking chair near the window, gazing out like a child who had been punished and sentenced to stand in a corner. The lights were off, so the room was full of shadows. She was wrapped in a shawl and appeared smaller than I remembered her. Her eyes were red, her face was pale, and it looked like she had been crying. I waited a moment, but she didn't even notice I entered the room. You got a half hour, the attendant reminded me firmly and stepped out, closing the door behind me. I went to Grandma Belinda and touched her hand. She turned slowly and looked up at me, expressionless, indifferent, a lost lamb. Hi, Grandma, it's Melanie. I came to see you again. How are you? I asked quickly. Why are you sitting in the shadows? She stared at me blankly, her eyelids blinking rapidly. I told her I was pregnant, she began. I told her it was Nelson's baby. She got very angry and swore at me and called me a liar. She called me terrible names and said she wouldn't help me if I told my lie to anyone else ever. But I wasn't lying. I wouldn't lie. Nelson? You mean Judge Childs? I asked, and I sat on the bed facing her. She rocked and nodded. Yes. There were other young men. I've always been very popular, she said with a flirtatious smile. Then in a heartbeat her face changed to an expression until she looked older, serious. But I should know who's the father of my child, don't you think? Her face turned angry. How can you doubt me, Olivia? You want to doubt me? You don't want it to be true because you've always loved Nelson. Well, don't blame me because he loves me more than he loves you. Grandma, I said softly, She seemed to be looking through me and not at me, her gaze distant. "Stop that laughing. I'm not lying. I'm not," she said, straining her throat until the veins in her neck were outlined. "It's all right, Grandma. It's all right. I believe you." And I took her hand. She stopped rocking and looked at me. She began to blink rapidly again, and then, like magic, her face brightened with a childlike smile. "It's a nice day," she said, glancing through the window. "It should be my birthday." She laughed and rocked. Then she stopped again, and her face grew darker, her eyes small and her lips taut. She shook her head. I was screaming upstairs, screaming at the top of my voice, "It's time! It's time!" The door was locked. She wanted me to lose the baby, you know. "Oh, don't look at me that way," she said, turning to me. "You're always taking her side." "Grandma," I said softly, "it's Melanie." She shook her head. Was she telling me the truth, or was everything so jumbled in her mind that her words were like a crossword puzzle, confused with another, the answers all to the wrong questions? She left me. No doctor, no midwife, no one. I guess you never knew that part, huh? A crazed twist shaped her lips, and she smiled so coldly it put ice in my veins. I delivered my own baby, and when she came up and found the baby was all right, she nearly died herself with disappointment. You never knew. I can see it on your face, Nelson. You never knew. She turned and rocked. I held my breath until I saw her chin begin to quiver and the first tear emerge. "Grandma," I said, "please don't. Please try to look at me and see me, please." What had they done to her? Why was she so confused and lost? How long had she been kept in this room? Her rocking stopped again. She took a deep breath and lowered her face until her chin rested on her chest. Then she closed her eyes and moments was asleep. I sat, waiting to see if she would wake up and go into another exclamation, drawing thoughts, memories, and words from some sort of secret place in her mind. The minutes ticked and she slept. If Nelson Childs was the father of her baby, then he's my real grandfather after all, and that made Kenneth my uncle. Did he know? What if none of this were true? But what if it were? "Oh, please wake up, Grandma," I thought. "I want to know more. I want to be sure." There was a gentle knock at the door. When I turned, a short, plump nurse entered carrying a cup of some water. "She dozed off again, has she?" she remarked. "What's wrong with her? She's so different from the way I saw her last time I was here. And it wasn't that long ago," I questioned. "When they reach this age, they've been sick and lived a hard life. Changes can occur from hour to hour," she said. "She's falling into Alzheimer's," she added. "In some cases, that's merciful." "Well, not in hers. She has a lot of years left. She can get better," I cried. The nurse raised her eyebrows and looked at me as if I were the one suffering from a mental aberrations. She shook Grandma Belinda's shoulder. "Come on, Belinda, time for your medicine," she said. Grandma's eyes fluttered open and she turned slowly. "Come on, dear, take your pills, remember?" "Pills? Again? Why so many pills, Olivia? Did the doctor really say I should take these too?" "Yes, he did." The nurse looked at me. "Who's Olivia?" she whispered. "Her sister." "Oh, yes. Belinda, he did. Come on, honey." "That's it," she said. "Now wash him down. Good girl." "What are those pills?" I asked. "They're a form of a tranquilizer to keep her calm," she said. "Maybe they're doing her more damage." "Are you a doctor?" the plump nurse asked with her face full of ridicule. "No, but, well, her doctor has prescribed them. If you have a problem with that, speak to Mrs. Green," she added and left the room. "I'd rather speak to the wall," I mumbled. Grandma Belinda was staring out the window again. I touched her hand and she turned slowly toward me, her eyes so sad they put tears in my heart. "Grandma, it's me, Melanie, remember?" She smiled. "Yes. He told me about you. He said you look just like your mother." Her smile evaporated. I can't remember what she looks like. She looked like you, I said. Did she? She smiled again and then gazed out the window while she spoke. It's my birthday, you know. We're having guests and a cake. Happy birthday, Grandma, I said, tears now building up under my eyelids. Everyone's gonna sing happy birthday to me, she turned. Even Olivia, because I'll look right at her and she'll have to sing, right? Yes, I said and smiled. Happy birthday to me. Happy birthday to me. Happy birthday, dear Belinda. Happy birthday to me. She closed her eyes. There was a harder knock on the door, and the attendant appeared. It's time, he said. It can't be a half an hour. It is, he insisted. Don't make it hard for me, will ya? He muttered, with threatening eyes. No, I said, standing. I'll leave that to Mrs. Green. I leaned over and kissed my grandmother on the cheek. She didn't open her eyes, and then I turned and marched past them down the corridor. The residents were being entertained by a singer in the lobby. She played the accordion as well. Mrs. Green was standing in the rear with some of the attendants, a receptionist, and some visitors. She glared my way, and I glared back as I left the lobby and stepped out of the building, my heart thumping so hard I thought it would drown out the singing. There was no one on the porch, but I saw Holly on the bench talking softly to some birds who had stared up at her as if they really understood. Even though I was still shaking, the sight brought laughter to my lips. She saw me and hurried up the walkway. How was your visit, she asked. Very bad, I said. They're medicating her into oblivion, and I have a feeling it's Grandma Olivia's fault. I have to pay her a visit. Oh, that's so sad. If we just taught them how to meditate, there would be no need for chemical therapy. There's no need for it now, I said, unless keeping the truth buried is a good reason. Holly's eyebrows lifted into question marks, but I didn't want to say anything until I was certain what I had heard was really the truth. At least now I understood why Grandma Olivia was so interested in learning what her sister had told me the first time. I felt as if I was opening a door to a vault covered with dust and cobwebs, its hinges rusted. This was no time to walk away. Could you do me a favor, I asked, and take me to my grandmother Olivia's house? It's just a little out of the way. No problem, Holly said, if that's what you want. Oh, it's what I want, I said, nodding. I never wanted it more.